This is a Security Weekly production. This week on Security Weekly, Ferruh Mavituna, the CEO of Netsparker, joins us to talk about web application security and a number of different topics that will be very interesting, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Apollo Clark is coming on to do a technical segment on improving your cloud security, specifically with Amazon AWS. In our stories of the week, who is the creator of Bitcoin? It's Craig Wright. No, maybe not. And ImageMagick vulnerabilities, we're going to talk about those, as well as some open SSL CVEs that came out this week, so stay tuned. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Security Weekly is brought to you by the SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security training, certification, and research. Visit SANS.org to explore the full curriculum and latest training offerings. Onapsis, the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle business-critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com. Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, the Pwn Phone, and the Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com.
And welcome to the show. Here's your host, a man who wouldn't be caught dead in this shirt, Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. We've got a fabulous show for you. Of course, Mr. Larry Pesci is here in studio.
Yes.
Couple of quick announcements. I want to mention, make sure you go to sourceconference.com, I should say. Security Weekly listeners do get a discount if you subscribe to our insider mailing list. You will get more information about that discount. This year's conference is going to be awesome. The lineup of speakers that Rob Shane's put together is absolutely fabulous. We will be there. Well, I say we. Keith will be there. Our fabulous executive producer will be there. I can't go to Boston because if my wife goes into labor and I get stuck in traffic, I'll miss the birth of my child.
and then and then all three of your sons will grow up without a father.
Yes. It's very bad. It's very bad. But Keith's going to be there, and we're giving away free Hack Naked t-shirts. All you have to do is let Keith scan your badge. You get a Hack Naked shirt.
That's nice.
And subscribe to our mailing list.
That's a damn good deal.
The worst it costs you is one ridiculous email from John or myself, and then you can unsubscribe if you want.
Heck, I get ridiculous emails from you guys all
the
the time.
For the past 10 years, you've gotten ridiculous
but you know
emails.
what? I've got a cadre of t-shirts at home, so it's totally fine.
So make sure you go to Source Conference. Also, Cloud Security World. I think it's Cloud. Is it Cloud Security? Shoot, I should know this.
It's Cloud Security
World.
Wow.
No, it's cloudsecurityworld.misty.com. That's another conference happening in Boston. Cloudsecurityworld.misty.com. Go there. Andrew Hay will be speaking, and many others. That's also another awesome conference. So if you're in the Boston area, you've got a series of awesome conferences coming your way. So make sure that you sign up for those. Apollo's going to be joining us shortly to do a tech segment. Before that, and before we talk about the Bitcoin creator, who is Craig Wright, but then maybe not Craig Wright, and not valid and invalidated by Dan Kaminsky, we should say. We're going to talk about all that in the ImageMagick vulnerability and the OpenSSL vulnerabilities and so much more.
So much more.
Before that, though, I got a chance to sit down with Ferruh Mavituna from Netsparker, and we talked about securing your PHP and WordPress installations and ways to scan them. We talked about how you can automatically generate mod security rules from web application scanners. We talked about a little bit about the software development lifecycle and testing Java applications, and we talked about some interesting facts around bug bounties. So that interview is coming up right now. So stay tuned. We're going to come back with a fabulous tech segment. So right now, here is Ferruh Mavituna from Netsparker.
Beautiful.
Hey there, Security Weekly listeners. I'm Paul Asadorian, and this is our feature interview for this evening with Ferruh Mavituna, no stranger to the Security Weekly show. Ferruh, welcome to the show.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for having me again.
Yes, and we've chosen some kind of somewhat random topics to talk about, but I think they're all awesome topics that we're going to cover today. And I wanted to start with PHP and WordPress. And it's interesting. We were just talking before the interview that this is kind of near and dear to my heart. I kind of put it in there somewhat selfishly because it's what we choose to use for our web technologies. And I say that by disclosing like what we're running, as if our listeners couldn't figure that out by a quick scan. As much as we would do to hide it, it's very hard to hide the fact that you're running WordPress. And I think let's talk about the business decision first. You know, we chose that as a platform because of a couple of reasons, right? It's very extensible. There's a lot of functionality. Coupled with that, there's security issues. But also, I think you were saying, Ferruh, is like 25% of the internet runs WordPress in some capacity. So finding people to help us work on things is easier because it's such a common platform. So talk a little about some of the security challenges, how they balance off on some of those business decisions.
I think security-wise, it gets even more interesting. Now, depending on how good you're at security, sometimes using an off-the-shelf product can make your life easier, right? Mm-hmm. For example, let's talk about WordPress. WordPress, at the end of the day, yes, there has been so many issues with WordPress in the history. So, you know, so many security problems being discovered. So it's not great, but on the other hand, so many have been discovered. So we hope to see less and less.
Right.
That's the theory. And it might be correct depending on your, you know, how much time you are willing to invest into a web application. For example, if you're a big company, got so many resources that you are happy to spend and you are good at security, all that kind of stuff, then you can say, you know, well, I'm not going to use WordPress or any off-the-shelf products just I can use. I will make something small, something secure because I know how to do it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, how many companies actually do know how to secure a web application? And the chances are WordPress possibly will be more secure than what you can do. You know, I'm not talking about you, obviously, you know, coming from security industry, you know, you will be able to find the right guys. But even when you do that, it will be expensive. It will take time. You will need to go through so many things. So, and there's another aspect. If there's a big WordPress security problem, the chances are before you got hacked, so many other people get hacked. So
right.
You'll be kind of notified if you're not a really high profile target.
No, that's an interesting point. And I like that angle. Is if you run a technology that's widely adopted and there's a big vulnerability in it, you're going to hear about it because so many people are getting compromised because everyone's running it. I also thought it was interesting too, Ferruh, you know, you said that a lot of larger companies, and I've seen this, say, well, I'm not going to use an off-the-shelf product. I'm going to build my own web application, and it's going to be smaller and very specially purpose-built. What I find ends up happening is one of two things, really, right? That when they write that application, as you alluded to, it can be even less secure than WordPress, depending on who builds it. But also the business drivers force that very specially purposed web application to start to grow. You know, and like I want more functionality. Hey, I want a blog on my website. Hey, I want to accept contact forms. I want to do lead tracking. And then, you know, then they start running code. It becomes more insecure. And they're trying to add these features where is the off-the-shelf thing more secure if you know you're going to have a lot of business drivers? Or is it better to build something yourself? Or is there something entirely different that you should approach you should take?
I think there is, from WordPress point of view, I think that's a great example. WordPress today can be anything. It can be a blog, it can be e-commerce, it can be anything really. It's so flexible at this point. It's more like a framework rather than a web application you can just install. And with millions of plugins, and the chances are when you have WordPress, you will go ahead and install lots of plugins as well. So let's compare that to a custom-built application. In custom-built application, you will definitely have way less code, much less complexity. And that means less vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, the chances are, as I said, your code, if you are not an expert and if you don't have spent a lot of money into the secure development, the testing, and all the secure development lifecycle, if it's not part of your development, then WordPress will be more secure. I mean, that's what I would bet on. But again, you definitely win on the complexity side. WordPress is super complex, and we know complexity is a big problem in any security thing. It's same for network, it's same for every other thing, and application is no difference. More complex your web application is, more vulnerabilities you will have. That's maybe the most reliable metric when we look at web applications and think about what's the likelihood of having a vulnerability.
What about the platform choice? I know that probably the top three are ASP.NET, Java, and probably PHP after that. I don't know, am I missing any of the major ones?
Actually, I think PHP and JavaScript is super popular now. And surprisingly, JavaScript is gaining a lot of traction in server sides. So, we have got so many platforms. I doubt it's higher than PHP or ASP.NET for that matter, but I think, it's close. Platform, framework, language, whatever you call them. For example, after all, ASP.NET, you can develop it various different languages, but at the end of the day, it will compile it to the, same IL code. It's the very same code, what it's compiled to. Platform is super important. We have seen this in the past. To give you a very concrete example, when we talk about vulnerabilities, we talk about two sets of vulnerabilities in web applications if we roughly divide them. One is, as a developer, you cannot do anything and you have no idea and you wouldn't have guessed kind of vulnerabilities.
Right.
We have seen them in PHP, we have seen them in ASP.NET. So to give you an example, in PHP, we have a set of issues that can just be exploited. As a developer, you have no control over it. In ASP.NET, we have seen similar issues, such as there was an issue about weave state decoding regarding to padding Oracle attacks, and which led to code execution pretty much in every single ASP.NET application because of the vulnerability was in the framework. So, it's, as a developer, you couldn't do anything about it. I'm going to kind of ignore this. Because this is something, as a developer, you cannot teach a developer to secure that. It's just a choice. So all we can do, we can look at the track record of these frameworks, these languages, and to be fair, PHP possibly is the worst one. But, Java, ASP.NET, we have seen similar vulnerabilities in them as well. But the real thing maybe we need to talk about what framework provides to the developer, how secure the framework is by default. And again, unfortunately, maybe, being one of the most popular languages, PHP, again, the most, the worst offender. Actually.
Oh, absolutely. And anyone, myself included, anyone who's written the PHP application is like, oh my God, it was so easy to just make it so insecure. And then you go to try and make it secure, and it's a lot of work, and there's not a lot of tools to help you or to secure a library. Like it's a nightmare.
It's pretty much insecure by default.
Right.
Everything you do is insecure. And let's think about certain set of vulnerabilities that only present themselves in PHP. To give you an example, the most common one, remote file inclusion. You don't see remote file inclusion vulnerabilities in other languages. It's so rare.
Oh, interesting.
The reason you have it in PHP, it's how PHP is designed, how it works with wrappers, how it works with external resources, and the famous include function. In ASP.NET, even if you wanted to put any remote file inclusion vulnerability, you had to write plenty amount of code.
Now, what about file upload? Does file upload fall into a similar category?
Arguably, yes. Yes, it's actually file upload got a different set of problems based on maybe more about the server rather than the framework. For example, in file upload, we have seen in PHP, for example, in file upload, you write a function and you say, okay, block.php. Okay, that's a logical thing to do. But Also, PHP 3 extension works and executed as PHP.
Right.
Just top of my head. In ASP though, in IIS, it's not much different. IIS got different similar bypasses, like you can add an extension, put a semicolon, add another extension, and then you will still bypass the blacklist, but it will get executed.
Right, but without, if ASP.NET prevents remote file inclusion better than PHP, that file upload vulnerability probably isn't as big of a deal in ASP.NET as it is in PHP, right? Because they go hand in hand.
Remote file, I'm not quite sure how much it affects, because in remote file inclusion, all you need to include a file from a different server. So in PHP, you can just say, okay, I'm going to attack this parameter with attacker.com/myshell dot blah, blah.
Right.
And PHP will download it and execute it, and you're done. But file upload maybe matters more if you have a local file inclusion, which you can easily have in ASP. But again, in ASP, you cannot convert a local file inclusion into a remote code execution vulnerability easily, because again, it won't execute the ASP code. But in PHP, as you said, if you can upload an image file, and if you have a local file inclusion, the chances are you will get code execution out of that. Not just ability to read some source code, but you will actually execute code.
Sorry, I meant local. I meant local file inclusion. Yeah, no,
right.
But you're absolutely right. Yeah. No, that's very, very interesting. So what can we do to secure? Well, actually, let's talk first about what are the strategies for scanning PHP and WordPress type applications. I get nervous if there's any kind of credentials because I feel like the database is so fragile in that environment. In fact, just today, I mean, my database in my development environment got corrupt, right? I spent like an hour or more recovering from that issue. I'm not sure it was because I installed some of the security plugins or what the problem was, but I feel like that's a very fragile relationship. So what can you do to more accurately scan WordPress, not just in the database aspect, but in general?
I think there are two aspects of securing an off-the-shelf product. The first thing is you need to keep up with the patch, right? Doesn't matter static or dynamic analysis. There are vulnerabilities. They will be logical vulnerabilities. They will not able to identify it automatically. So you definitely need to keep up with the patches, right? If they fix something, it's like your Windows update, is like your operating system updates. Just do them. And the second aspect of it, what is in there on top of the default setup. You can go ahead and scan the default setup, but the chances are so many people already scanned the default setups with pretty much all the tools that you have ever used. So if there was a vulnerability, the chances are that vulnerability has been already identified and hopefully fixed. But what you're looking for is the custom code, custom plugins, and obscure plugins. You really want to scan them. You really want to understand what is in them. And they can be anything. Unfortunately, unlike, let's say, mobile phones and stuff, most of the web application plugin environments don't have proper sandboxes. If that was the case, then when you download a plugin, you will say, okay, this plugin can access my database. This plugin can access the file. And, I should be worried. I should be really careful about, I should be maybe source code review this or whatever I need to do or scan this, properly. But we don't have that. It's very rare even if it's there.
It'd be interesting, Ferruh, based on what you said. When I put in, it's an interesting analogy. When I put an app on my phone, and it says, hey, when I'm installing this application needs access to your contacts, it needs access to your photos and images and things like that. When you install a plugin in WordPress, it doesn't ask you any of that. And pretty much by default, it has access to everything, correct?
That's correct. It has access to everything. And it's scary, isn't it?
Yeah,
You've got this old database, you got all your applications. You mentioned your database corrupted or your setup corrupted, and maybe it's because of plugin. Even from that point of view, you really, we will really love to see that kind of sandboxing. But to be fair, it's very complex, maybe not even possible in many cases.
Right. What about CSS or cascading style sheets? Are there a lot of vulnerabilities in there? I know, like when we talk about a WordPress theme, for example, a lot of that is really just a bunch of CSS inside of the theme. And I know there's CSS injection vulnerabilities, but What are some of the ones that you check for CSS vulnerabilities?
I think CSS itself in modern web applications is relatively harmless, but you can still get cross-site scripting out of that. But the good thing is you won't get local file inclusion, remote file inclusion, or code execution.
Right.
Not to say XSS is not important, because we have seen, for example, Apache, foundation got hacked because of a cross-site scripting. So we know cross-site scripting can be very disruptive. Having said that, having a cross-site scripting through a theme CSS, that's very unlikely, because the features they will be using, they won't be taking dynamic parameters. Therefore, there is no attack surface. So someone need to go ahead and backdoor it. That's the only attack surface there. And that's fairly easy to spot. So it's very unlikely attack surface, and it's fairly safe. But one thing you don't want to do, you don't want your users to control your CSS or customize it for someone else or to share within your domain. That can get tricky with not only cross-site scripting attacks, potential cross-site scripting issues. There are data filtration issues, like they can extract piece of content from the current user session, or there are issues such as they can redraw the user interface in a way they can carry out phishing attacks or all sort of stuff on your domain. So that's something you don't want. But when it comes to themes, you are generally safe. I would say, there's not much risk in as long as it's not intentional backdoored.
I see. So some applications will accept user parameters, and then based on those user parameters, change the CSS of the website?
That's something you don't want.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the use case for that.
Easy.
That's interesting.
And another thing about themes, actually, Netsparker, what we do is with Netsparker to prove and to improve the quality of the scanner, we scan open source applications. So far, we have scanned about 500 applications. This includes applications such as WordPress and even WordPress plugins and stuff. And, we have released over, I think, 100 advisories. So all these are 0 days. It's quite scary when you think about an automated scanner can go ahead and find 0 days in applications such as WordPress completely automatically. And my point being, we found one vulnerability in one of the default WordPress themes. It was a DOM cross-site scripting.
Right.
So even though your theme might not have a PHP file that takes a parameter and executes it, even the JavaScript content of the theme, which I think many of them do have some sort of JavaScript and CSS. So that JavaScript is also quite dangerous. And a DOM cross-site scripting, such as the one that we found, might affect you. And in our case, because it was one of the default themes, even if you weren't using it, you were vulnerable.
Right,
because it's just sitting in that directory.
Yeah, those files are there. Even though you're not using them, and they're still accessible and can be exploited. That's maybe that should be part of the WordPress hardening, right? Yes. What is not necessary is like one of the golden rules of security. If it's not necessary, just get rid of it. Right. And if you're not using that particular theme or a plugin, you might not be updating it because I'm not using it, but that code is all still sitting there. One of the things when I look at securing web applications is I look towards mod security. Now, we've already stated how complex an environment such as WordPress can be, and tuning mod security for your environment is, I think, a tremendous amount of work. I know that TrustWave has like a commercial feed for that kind of thing where they've actually done a bunch of tuning, but I still think it's all going to be a lot of application-dependent tuning you have to do with mod security. But you have a way to generate some mod security rules from Netsparker, is that correct?
That's correct. It's one of our recent features, and the reason for that, in web applications are complex. We've been talking about it forever. And one of the themes, one of the patterns that we have seen, you tell the user, or the user, runs a test, and they found a vulnerability. Now, what do? They go ahead, they talk with the developers figure out, particular source code, they figure out how they need to fix it. And this takes time, then it goes through the QA, depending on the agility, how important security in that particular company, all that. This can easily take from a couple of days to 6 months, easily. And we know that because if you look at the bug bounty reports, and if you look at some popular advisories, you can spot advisories with like a timeline of 1.5 years. So that means those guys just sit on that vulnerability for 1.5 years. And in the meantime, they were vulnerable.
Right.
So what we said, okay, in the meantime, they are vulnerable. So can we just patch it temporarily? Web application firewalls are good. And they are, the analogy I use, it's like a doctor, what we do from scanning point of view, we tell you what is wrong with you. We give you a medicine that will solve, that will make you well, and you won't have this particular problem anymore. And web application firewall is more like you are coughing, and it's a cough medicine. It doesn't fix you. It doesn't solve the cause of the problem. It just gets rid of the symptoms.
Right.
And that's not necessarily bad. Just like in real world, you go ahead and use the cough medicine because all you need until you get better is a cough medicine. So that's what we do. When we find a vulnerability now, we generate a web application firewall rule for mod security, particularly at this point. And then you can just import them into your rules and you're done.
I think that's great. I mean, say what you will about web application firewalls. Mod security is very closely, obviously, tied to Apache. It's a module in Apache, which I think allows you to be very specific, certainly with some of the rules. It's not an external web application firewall, which I think also probably has some performance benefits as well. And like you said, to be able to put that stopgap measure, because you're not going to be able, let's say you scan your website and you find 8 critical vulnerabilities. Like you said, you got to go to your developers and say, okay, when are you going to fix these? Now, they're not going to be able to fix all 8 all at once, right? There's a development life cycle that has to take place to fix those vulnerabilities. So having some kind of stopgap measure. My fear is, though, that people will become too dependent on that, right? Like, I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm just going to keep taking cough medicine, right, until it gets so bad that I'm in the hospital kind of thing, right? Or use this web application firewall instead of actually fixing the problem so long that someone finds a bypass or the code never gets fixed. So
that's the exact wording, Pete. In web application firewalls, we know the history on that. They got a very bad track record. And I've seen so many bypasses in web application firewalls, and ironically, majority of them formed by one person who got stuck. They are doing pen testing, and they got a web application firewall, and they're like, okay, how am I going to bypass this? And they just go ahead and bypass it. And I've got a similar story about that. ASP.NET has a web application firewall kind of generic catch-all cross-site scripting protection. So this has been about 8 years maybe. 9 years actually, yeah, I think. So about 9 years ago, I was doing pen testing, and this is early times of ASP.NET. And the very same thing happened. I'm trying to get a cross-site scripting working. The application is vulnerable. They don't actually encode the output correctly, but ASP.NET doesn't let me to exploit it. So I'm like, okay, can I bypass this? And it takes like 30 minutes to bypass that. And we've seen so many stories in web application firewalls exactly like this. So this is scary because this means it's not that hard to bypass this if you really want to. And that's maybe, they are good from defense and depth purposes, but they are not something you can just rely and say, okay, I've got a web application firewall, I am secure. That's definitely not the case.
Absolutely. So let's see, the next story I have here was the SDLC in dynamically testing Java applications. There was something specific that I wanted to mention in this article as well. This came out of the SANS Institute. And so being able to perform static analysis on source code before performing a deployment build gives the team a strong edge in creating secure applications. However, the article kind of goes on to talk about how developers need to understand security. And I think today, many may understand cross-site scripting, SQL injection, but now we get into some of the more advanced attacks, and it's a difficult thing, I think, to educate your developers so that there aren't all these other weird vulnerabilities or easily exploitable vulnerabilities that don't fall in like the cross-site scripting, SQL injection category.
That's one of the biggest problems. What happens is part of the problem. We always talk about educating our developers, and that's fair. They need to understand basic concept of web application security. They need to understand they cannot trust input.
Right.
Input is bad. They need to understand output encoding. If they don't understand this, you cannot expect a secure system out of them. It's just not possible. They will mess it up. The second thing is they need to understand the security features of their frameworks easily. And we briefly talk about framework security, but I think this is a great example. For example, cross-site request forgery is a huge issue. But if your framework comes with it by default, or if it's just a Boolean switch that you can enable, like ASP.NET MVC and plenty of other frameworks, then that's great. You don't need to understand CSRF. All you need to do is, you need to enable that stuff, and you're good.
So is it something that you enable or something that you have to code specifically for that platform? Or is it very simply a switch?
It's a switch. In this particular case, for example, in ASP.NET, and there are a couple of other frameworks like that, it's just a matter of a switch. And that's fantastic. I think Struts is, for example, like that, and many other MVC kind of frameworks particularly. So that's great. That's the right way to do security. And that's something you can teach your developer. And they should really know this. But what happens is, all other kind of issues, as you mentioned, edge cases and the new stuff. So right now, we have two new things coming up. One is new cookie changes, right? One is cookie prefixes. So we are adding in these secure and host prefixes for certain attacks. And the other one is same-site cookies for, extra protection for cross-site request forgery attacks. So do we expect developers to keep up to date with this? Every single change? Is it reasonable expectation? Do we expect them to understand every single edge case with JavaScript implementation so they are secure against really obscure cross-site scripting attacks? Do they need to understand how intent exploit a particular JavaScript can be exploited in Internet Explorer in edge mode, stuff like that? I don't think that's reasonable or realistic, So we can give them some basics. And then the part of it needs to be handled in an automated manner. And automation can train developers. That's another good thing about automation. To give, the very same example, we are talking about new cookie features or even recent stuff, relatively recent, like usage of HSTS, which is a real right way to implement HTTPS in web applications, right? So in an automated tool, it will immediately tell the user, look, you have an application, it's over HTTPS, but you're not using HSTS. You really should do, because these are all the advantages, and this is how you implement it. So you see, now this developer sees this report and he's like, okay, this makes sense. I understand what this is for, how can I implement it? Then, he or she goes ahead and implement that. And that's, again, depending on the framework, can be complicated or very easy. It might be a simple switch, it might be a code, or it might be a library you can just, use.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I like that because we talk about training, and I think we look at training as, okay, I'm going to go train my developers. Okay, I'm done training my developers. You're never really done training your developers, but putting them in the process, right? They're continually learning these new techniques for attacking and defending and constantly improving their applications, because one of the things with web applications especially, and I mean, let's just be honest, mobile applications are essentially primarily web applications. They're always changing. There's always new features. There's always new things going on, and you have to continually apply security to that process. It's not just like, I train my developers in security, I'm done, I met the regulatory compliance, we did training, we're done, right?
Definitely. So I think from the way I look at it, you need to train your developers in the mind. They need to get into that security mindset. They need to understand core basics of security. Something not necessary, don't put it into the code. Something is not necessary, delete from your web server and everything. When you develop something, do not trust the input. When you output something to another subsystem, know your encoding. Stick with your libraries, and other best coding practices and secure coding practices, like you need to have centralized code base and that kind of stuff. But these won't solve all these edge cases, and these won't solve the problem that they will not able to keep up to date with every single new security issues or every single new security improvement feature added to your browsers, client side or server side or whatever. That's, I think, where automation is very useful, because when they see more issues, they will address them. And if you try to put them on a process where you can every week or every other week you try to teach them security, that's hell of a job. I don't even know if I don't think any company actually doing that. I met with so many development teams. I met with so many development teams with very good secure secure teams and everything. That's just not scalable. That's just not realistic.
Yeah, and it's certainly a process. As we were talking before the show, you can't just do one thing. You gotta have a layered approach, like you were alluding to with the WAF as well. I do want to talk about a specific vulnerability in ImageMagick, and this is not the first vulnerability that I've seen in ImageMagick over my 10 plus years of covering security news. This one seems a little scary to me. I don't know. Maybe you've got a different take on it, Ferruh, but it's basically a remote code execution bug in the ImageMagick libraries, which are used by a lot of websites and web applications.
I actually looked into it and, looked into what's the problem, what's the exploit. There are various bugs in it, but the core of the problem is this image library is passing parameters to shell. That's the core of it, which also, it's not escaping them correctly, which, leads to remote code execution. Now, the real question is from web application point of view, if you use this library in the backend and passing parameters to this library, do you do your job? But chances are you won't. You won't pass, you won't do certain kind of encoding or escaping, because the chances are you don't even know that the library, ImageMagick library, is actually passing those parameters into shell.
Right.
That's not an expected behavior from a library.
No. And
So
I think a generally bad way to do it, too. I mean, when you think about what ImageMagick does, I understand why it goes to the command line, because it was originally like a command line tool, right? And uses a lot of the command line tools to manipulate images. I wonder why it doesn't do all that in the code space that's running in the web application.
Actually, I briefly read about it. The explanation for that was because it supports various different formats, and they don't build all these formats. They didn't develop the support for all these formats. So they are using all these different set of tools to pass parameters and commands so they can do that. I think that's part of the problem, and that's why it's designed that way. But also it supports crazy stuff like, similar to PHP issue, it can actually grab a file from another protocol. So it will actually make an HTTP request in the backend. So that's obviously, and then we'll grab that file and do stuff on that file. And image format itself is quite tricky. We have seen so many problems with image formats in the past. I'm sure you remember the famous WMF vulnerability.
Yes,
which is,
yes.
Yeah, code execution as a feature.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, and the problem is when you try to, again, this is an input, right? You are getting an input from the customer, you use it, an image. How do you check whether an image is an actual image? That's tricky. And that's something also they fail, because one of the exploits, what you do, you create a GIF file and put code in it, and it will still go through many checks. It will still go to, this is not ImageMagick specific, but generally, if you are developing an application and accepting image as an upload, the content of the image can be dangerous. You can easily inject, for example, PHP code into an image, and from an image processor point of view, it will be a still valid image format. It's not that tricky, even without EXIF. With EXIF, it's very straightforward if you just add that stuff into the EXIF data part of the image. Yeah. But even without EXIF, it's very possible and it's dangerous. So,
and the image still renders?
It does.
Interesting.
It's not necessarily pretty, but it does render.
I gotcha. No, that's really cool. So the mitigation for this is to apply a patch which isn't out yet, right?
I didn't catch that actually. I'm not quite sure the patch is out or not. I know they were waiting to publish the exploits, but just someone found out in the comments in Hacker News and they said, what the hell, I'm just gonna publish it now. So I guess you're right. The patch is not out there, but they published the exploit anyway because, people figured it out. It was almost very straightforward based on the changes. Oh, having said that, I'm pretty sure they got GitHub commits that fixes the vulnerability. I don't know how reliable it is or ready for production, but I've seen the changes, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, they did publish a workaround which edits the policy.xml file
Right.
in ImageMagick, and it did say, I don't know if this article is dated or not, but it's interesting. They say the patch was a fix has been promised for the weekend starting 4/23/2016, which was last month.
Okay.
Interesting, but this article was published like today. So
Yeah, I suppose it's patched though. Yeah, as I
Yeah.
said, because they've done the commit changes.
right,
Presumably they are working fine, so it's supposed to be patched. Yeah.
awesome.
But it shows us how you cannot just trust on a third-party library. Yet you have to, because if you're not, it's not practical.
Ferruh, you also want to talk about some bug bounty stuff too, which I think is interesting. I was reading about some bug bounty stuff recently, as one of my friend's sons now actually went to work for Facebook, and he was telling me like how crazy they are about security. And Facebook being, I think, the largest subscribed to web application on the planet. I think I'm pretty safe in saying that, right? So they've got a big responsibility applying security to that. Now, what's interesting is in the past year, I want to say, Facebook spent almost $1 million and paid out bug bounties to over 200 individuals, averaging about $13,000 or $14,000 per individual for bug bounty programs. So it's clear that when you're Facebook, I mean, that's not a lot of money, but that's a lot of people and a lot of bugs that they fixed as a result of that program, I would imagine. And I think it's pretty successful for Facebook because I haven't heard about a big Facebook vulnerability in a while. And I don't know if that's a measure of success or how you feel about how you measure the success of a bug bounty program.
I think that's a very good point. And you and I remember how it was. So it's kind of, we are in a different landscape right now. When back in the day, when you find a vulnerability, all you care is about, hopefully I'm not going to go to jail.
Right. Even before that, if you found a vulnerability, like we went from like no one caring, right?
Right.
Like in the late 90s, early 2000s, like I found a web vulnerability. They're like, I don't care about that, whatever, right? We went to like ninja lawyers, like coming down from helicopters and police breaking down your door if you disclosed a web vulnerability, to now where the companies give you money if you find a vulnerability. Like it's just amazing how we've seen the progression like that.
That's fantastic. I think it's literally one of the biggest wins of security. This is great. I don't think anyone could have imagined this 10 years ago. This
Right.
was utopia in security community. But anyway, so we came to this point, and I think that's why we are not hearing vulnerabilities in Facebook are being exploited. Because people are actually finding vulnerabilities and they simply say, I'm just gonna sell it.
Right.
It's okay, you're gonna get a 5,000-10,000, I think at most, which is, I don't know how obviously if you decide to value a vulnerability based on the potential impact in the hands of a bad guy, then so many vulnerabilities such as remote code execution should value like a couple of $1 million for a company like Facebook.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's not happening. But at the end of the day, they are definitely getting more and more secure. The interesting bit though, what we see so almost obvious issues with companies such as Facebook to compare it with another actual hack. For example, hacks such as Hacking Team or FinFisher, that kind of hacks, when you read about how they got hacked, it's actually very interesting. You see that, for example, they found a 0-day in one of the routers, or I think another devices.
Yeah,
Anyway.
it was an embedded system. Yeah, he found
It was an embedded system.
Yeah,
That's what I remember.
He
right?
said it took him a couple of weeks, and they found a 0-day vulnerability, which then let him he customized firmware to use that vulnerability to replace the firmware on the device.
Right. Which is pretty cool, pretty impressive by all means. And we don't see that. Oh, I'm sure we see that now and then in bug bounties. But what we see more than that, what we see is very well-known vulnerabilities. And one of the common patterns is, okay, we forgot this server in here with default password, and you can actually access our database from there.
Yeah,
And,
I see a lot of that too. For when I read about some of the bounties, it's like they didn't find a vulnerability on. Stop using Facebook. I'll use Uber because you mentioned Uber in your notes, right?
Yeah.
But like Uber has like another server that they're piloting some program or some server that hosts some files, and they forgot to apply the security to that server, and they got a bug bounty because there was a SQL injection or cross-site scripting or CSRF on that particular system.
Yeah, and that shows us one thing. Even these big companies who cares about security, who is maybe crazy about security, they are doing bug bounties, they got dedicated security teams. I'm sure they do so many other things, right? Even then, they don't have this process of they still can forget stuff.
Right.
That's shocking, but that's the reality that we keep repeatedly seeing it. And that's why, again, automation and the process matters a lot. If you have a policy, this is a problem that you can solve with a policy plus automation. If you know your inventory, if you know all of your servers, if you know all of your applications, then you can automate it, and all of these very easy to find vulnerabilities will be found. That's not rocket science. It's a very well solved problem.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a.
Don't see.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't start to interrupt you. But I was just going to say, we have automation on the building of the application side, right? So we use virtualization, containers, cloud security, and we can script the whole thing of creating all of this environment. We need automation on the other side to be able to test it all. It needs to be balanced, right?
Right. And we're actually doing solutions now. I mean, they're not all necessarily perfect, but we have scalable web application scanning. We have scalable network infrastructure scanning. And however, if you don't know you even have a web application in the first place, if you don't know how many web servers you have, and honestly, so many companies don't, then that's how the problem is solved, because you need to start from the 101 kind of, okay, let's get that infrastructure in place. Let's ensure people are not just deploying stuff on our public interface where with access to critical parts of our network or components or servers or APIs. Facebook got a similar thing, right? They forgot an old API that you can just get and access everyone's data.
Right.
And that's just insane. But it happens,
So, Ferruh, in terms of the Netsparker product, we talked about a couple of new features. Are there any new features in the Netsparker Cloud or Netsparker scanning application?
Yes, we actually got a couple of cool new features. One of the things we are focusing right now, one thing we used to do always is eliminating false positive by safely exporting vulnerabilities. So when a SQL injection is being identified in an application, Netsparker safely exploits it and marks it as confirmed. So when user sees it, they know it's confirmed. They don't have to double check it. That's all good. That's perfect. But what we have seen in real world, there are two problems. One, because of the past experience mostly, users still do not trust the scanner. They say, okay, scanner tells me confirm, but no, I'm not going to believe that. I've been burned by that so many times before.
Right.
Yeah. Even though we don't have that problem, and after a while, users get used to it, and they say, okay, I've been double checking this for a year and never seen a confirmed issue turn out to be a false positive, so I will stop checking that. That's good, users get that. But what we said, okay, apparently we got this problem, and we still have the problem of convincing developers they have the vulnerability in the first place, because developers sometimes comes back to security guys and say, I don't have a problem in here. I'm sure your tool is, giving me false positive and stuff like that. And the security guy then have to figure out how to exploit it and, show him, make kind of a demonstration to prove that the vulnerability exists. Now, what we do instead of that, we automated that as well. Now, Netsparker just doesn't tell you there's a SQL injection and an attacker might steal your data. It tells you, look, there's a SQL injection. I figured out how to exploit it. I marked it as confirmed. And here is the data from your database. Here is your database username. Here is your database version. And here is the database name. And when you have it, when you show it to your developer, well, it's done deal, right? You definitely hacked into that application. It's been proven.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So many of us have been in that situation or in that situation today where the developers just don't believe you, and then you have evidence. Sometimes even if you do have evidence, developers still don't want to believe you, but that's not a problem that an automated scanner can fix, right? That's an interpersonal...
That's the denial stage.
Yeah, it's a leadership thing. There has to be a good working relationship with the security team. But it's great that you've done all those steps so that as security people now, you can kind of focus on working more with your developers rather than spending the time before, like going to try and exploit it to prove it. Like there's a less step in there to getting to the point where code is actually getting fixed, which is great.
Correct. Another thing also we are focusing is single page applications. We are seeing more and more in the public. We got AngularJS and so many new JavaScript frameworks, and we got so many new single page application models. Now we are focusing on the challenges of single page applications. Like in a single page applications, you can have multiple states. How can you cover multiple states? How can you, for example, there is an input and it has, let's say, autocomplete feature. How can you make the application trigger that autocomplete feature so you can see the interaction and you can test that interaction as well? So that's something we've been focusing, and we really added lots of new features to support single page applications much better now. So, it's a constant battle between modern web development, new features, and how can we support all of those?
Yeah, and I think you're going to be busy for a really long time because I think that there's always going to be, in the past several years that we've been talking about web applications and web technology, even before I started doing the show, we looked at CGI scripts in 1999 to where we are today. There's always something new, especially with web applications. So you get your work cut out for you in that respect.
Yeah,
so.
we've been doing this for 7 years for Netsparker, and before that, I was in web development and web security for about 14 years now. But for Netsparker, for the last 7 years, we have seen so many changes. Because we have to support every single new thing. We keep a really close eye on what's getting popular, what are the new technologies. It's insane. It's just insane, and so many new development models, they are just so different. And they come with their own security challenges, not from our point of view, from developers' point of view as well. Like, we know how to solve cross-site request forgery, but when you move it to XML HTTP request, JSON, and all that kind of stuff, now you got a slightly different problem. Not everyone knows how to solve perfectly, or there is no well-defined way to solve it.
Everything old becomes new again.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Ferruh, thank you very much for appearing on Security Weekly again. As always, it's a pleasure speaking with you. And that concludes this interview, so stay tuned. We'll be right back.